In Desert and Wilderness, Chapter 7. In the meantime, the camels swept like a hurricane over the sands, glistening in the moonlight. A deep night fell. The moon, at the beginning as big as a wheel and ruddy, became pale and rolled on high. The distant desert hills were enveloped with silvery vapors like muslin, which, not veiling their view, transformed them as if into luminous phenomena. From time to time, from beyond the rocks, scattered here and there, came the piteous whining of jackals. Another hour passed. Staś held Nell in his arms and supported her, endeavoring in his way to allay the fatiguing jolts of the mad ride. The little girl began more and more frequently to ask him why they were speeding so, and why they did not see their tents and their papas. Staś finally determined to tell her the truth, which sooner or later he would have to disclose. "Nell," he said, "pull off a glove and drop it unobserved on the ground." "Why, Staś?" And he passed her to himself and answered with a kind of tenderness unusual to him, "Do what I tell you." Nell held Staś with one hand and feared to let him go. But she overcame the difficulty in this manner. She began to pull the glove with her teeth, each finger separately, and finally taking it off entirely, she dropped it on the ground. After a time, "Throw the other," again spoke Staś. "I already have dropped mine, but yours will be easier to observe, for they are bright." And observing that the little girl gazed at him with an inquiring look, he continued, "Don't get frightened, Nell. It may be that we will not meet your or my father at all, and that these foul people have kidnapped us. But don't fear, for if it is so, then the pursuers will follow them. They will overtake them and surely rescue us. I told you to drop the gloves so that the pursuers may find clues. In the meantime, we can do nothing, but later I shall contrive something. Surely I shall contrive something. Only do not fear, and trust me." But Nell, learning that she should not see her papa and that they are flying somewhere far in the desert, began to tremble from fright and cry, clinging at the same time close to Staś and asking him amid her sobs why they kidnapped them and where they were taking them. He comforted him as well as he could, almost in the same words with which his father comforted Mr. Rawlinson. He said that their parents themselves would follow in pursuit and would notify all the garrisons along the Nile. In the end, he assured her that whatever might happen, he would never abandon her and would always defend her. But her grief and longing for her father were stronger even than fear, so for a long time she did not cease to weep, and thus they flew, both sad, on a bright night, over the pale sands of the desert. Sorrow and fear not only oppressed Staś hard, but also shame. He was not indeed to blame for what had happened, yet he recalled the former boastfulness for which his father so often had rebuked him. Formerly he was convinced that there was no situation to which he was not equal. He considered himself a kind of unvanquished swashbuckler and was ready to challenge the whole world. Now he understood that he was a small boy with whom everybody could do as he pleased, and that he was speeding in spite of his will on a camel merely because that camel was driven from behind by a half-savage Sudanese. He felt terribly humiliated and did not see any way of resisting. He had to admit to himself that he plainly feared those men and the desert and what he and Nell might meet. He promised sincerely not only to her but to himself that he would watch over and defend her even at the cost of his own life. Nell, weary with weeping and the mad ride, which had lasted already 6 hours, finally began to doze, and at times fell asleep. Staś, knowing that whoever fell from a galloping camel might be killed on the spot, tied her to himself with a rope which he found on the saddle. But after some time it seemed to him that the speed of the camels became less rapid, though now they flew over smooth and soft sands. In the distance could be seen only the shifting hills, while on the plain began the nocturnal illusions common to the desert. The moon shone in the heaven more and more palely, and in the meantime there appeared before them, creeping low, strange rosy clouds, entirely transparent, woven only from light. They formed mysteriously and moved ahead as if pushed by the light breeze. Staś saw how the burnouses of the Bedouins and the camels became roseate when they rode into that illuminated space, and afterwards the whole caravan was enveloped in a delicate rosy luster. At times the clouds assumed an azure hue, and thus it continued until the hills were reached. Near the hills the speed of the camels slackened yet more. All about could be seen rocks protruding from sandy knolls or strewn in wild disorder amidst the sand dunes. The ground became stony. They crossed a few hollows, sown with stone and resembling the dried-up beds of rivers. At times their road was barred with ravines, about which they had to make a detour. The animals began to step carefully, moving their legs with precision, as if in a dance, among the dry and hard bushes formed by roses of Jericho, with which the dunes and rocks were abundantly covered. Time and again some of the camels would stumble, and it was apparent that it was due to them to give them rest. Accordingly, the Bedouins stopped in a sunken pass, and dismounting from the saddles, proceeded to untie the packs. Idris and Gebr followed their example. They began to attend to the camels, to loosen the saddle girths, remove the supplies and provisions, and seek flat stones on which to build a fire. There was no wood or dry dung, which Arabs use, but Hamis, son of Hadigi, plucked roses of Jericho and built of them a big pile to which he set fire. For some time, while the Sudanese were engaged with the camels, Staś and Nell and her nurse, old Dinah, found themselves together, somewhat apart. But Dinah was more frightened than the children and could not say a word. She only wrapped Nell in a warm plate, and sitting close to her began with a moan to kiss her little hands. Staś at once asked Hamis the meaning of what had happened, but he, laughing, only displayed his white teeth and went to gather more roses of Jericho. Idris, questioned afterwards, answered with these words, "You will see," and threatened him with his finger. When the fire of roses, which smoldered more than blazed, finally glowed, they all surrounded it in a circle, except Gebr, who remained with the camels, and they began to eat cakes of maize and dried mutton and goat's meat. The children, famished by the long journey, also ate, though at the same time Nell's eyes were closed by sleepiness. But in the meantime, in the faint light of the fire, appeared dark-skinned Gebr with glittering eyes. He held up two bright little gloves and asked, "Whose are these?" "Mine," answered Nell, with a sleepy and tired voice. "Yours, little viper," the Sudanese hissed through his set teeth. "Then you mark the road so that your father can know where to pursue us." Saying this, he struck her with a kubash, a terrible Arabian whip, which cuts even the hide of camel. Nell, though she was wrapped in a thick plaid, shrieked from pain and fright, but Gebr was unable to strike her a second time, for at that moment Staś leaped like a wild cat, butted Gebr's breast with his head, and afterwards clutched him by the throat. It happened so unexpectedly that the Sudanese fell upon his back and Staś on top of him, and both began to roll on the ground. The boy was exceptionally strong for his age. Nevertheless, Gebr soon overcame him. He first pulled his hands from his throat, after which he turned him over with face to the ground, and pressing heavily on his neck with his fist, he began to lash his back with the kubash. The shrieks and tears of Nell, who, seizing the hand of the savage, at the same time begged him to forgive Staś, would not have availed if Idris had not unexpectedly come to the boy's assistance. He was older than Gebr, and from the beginning of the flight from Garak al-Sultani, all complied with his orders. Now he snatched the kubash from his brother's hand, and pushing him away exclaimed, "Away, you fool!" "I'll flog that scorpion," answered Geb, gnashing his teeth. But at this Idris seized his cloak at the breast and, gazing into his eyes, began to say in a threatening though quiet voice, "The noble Fatma forbade us to do any harm to those children, for they interceded for her." "I'll flog him," iterated Gebr. "And I tell you that you shall not raise the courbash at either of them. If you do, for every blow I shall give you 10. And he began to shake him like a bough of a palm, after which he thus continued, "Those children are the property of Smain, and if either of them does not reach him alive, the Mahdi himself, may God prolong his days infinitely, would command you to be hung. Do you understand, you fool?" The name of the Mahdi created such a great impression upon all his believers that Gabriel drooped his head at once and began to repeat as if with fear, "Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar." Stash rose, panting and whipped, but felt that if his father could have seen him and heard at this moment, he would have been proud of him, for he had not only leaped to save Nell without thinking, but now, though the blows of the courbash burned him like fire, he did not think of his own pain, but instead began to console and ask the little girl whether the blow had injured her. And afterwards he said, "Whatever I got, but he will never attack you. Oh, if only I had some weapon." The little woman entwined his neck with her arms and, dampening his cheeks with tears, began to assure him that it did not pain her very much, and that she was crying not from pain but from sorrow for him. At this Stash put his lips to her ear and whispered, "Nell, I swear that not because he whipped me, but because he struck you, I shall not forgive him." With that incident closed. After a certain time, Gebr and Idris, becoming reconciled, spread out the cloaks upon the ground and lay upon them, and Hamis soon followed their example. The Bedouins poured out durra for the camels, after which, having mounted 2 unengaged camels, they rode in the direction of the Nile. Nell, supporting her head on old Dinah's knees, fell asleep. The fire was dying out, and soon could be heard only the grinding of the durra in the camel's teeth. On high rolled small clouds, which at times veiled the moon, but the night was clear. Beyond the rocks resounded the mournful whining of jackals. After 2 hours the Bedouins returned with the camels, bearing leather bags filled with water. Having fed the fire, they sat on the sand and commenced to eat. Their arrival awoke Stash, who previously had been dozing, as well as Hamis, son of Hadigi, and the 2 Sudanese. Then at the campfire began the following conversation. "Can we start?" Idris asked. "No, because we must rest, we and our camels." "Did anyone see you?" "Nobody. We reached the river between 2 villages. In the distance dogs barked. It will be necessary always to go for water at midnight and draw it at deserted places. Only let us get past the first Chala cataract. Beyond that, the villages are further apart and they are more friendly to the Prophet. A pursuing party will undoubtedly follow us." At this, Hamis turned over with his back up and, resting his face on his hands, said, "The Mehendes will first wait for the children in El-Fachen during the whole night and until the following train. Later they will go to Fayum and from there to Garak. Only there will they understand what has happened, and then they will have to return to Medinet to send words flying over the copper wire to cities on the Nile and to the camel corps which will pursue us. All that will take at least 3 days. Therefore, we do not need to tire our camels and can peacefully drink smoke from pipe stems." Saying this, he pulled out a sprig of a rose of Jericho and lit his pipe with it, while Idris began, according to the Arabian habit, to smack his lips with satisfaction. "You arranged it well, son of Hadigi," he said, "but it is necessary for us to take advantage of the time and to drive during those 3 days and nights as far as possible southward. I shall breathe freely only when we shall cross the desert between the Nile and Kharga, a great oasis west of the Nile. God grant the camels hold out. They will hold out, declared one of the Bedouins. People also say, interposed Kamis, that the army of the Mahdi, may God prolong his life, has already reached Aswan. Here Staś, who did not lose a word of this conversation and remembered also what Idris had said to Gebr, rose and said, "The army of the Mahdi is below Khartoum." "La, no," Hamis contradicted. "Don't pay any attention to his words," Staś replied, "for he not only has a dark skin but also a dark brain. Although you bought fresh camels every 3 days and rushed as you have done this day, you would not reach Khartoum for a month. And perhaps you do not know that an English, not an Egyptian, army bars the road to you." These words created a certain impression, and Staś, observing this, continued, "Before you find yourselves between the Nile and the great oasis, all the roads on the desert will be picketed by a line of army sentinels. Words over the copper wire speed quicker than camels. How will you be able to slip through?" "The desert is wide," answered one of the Bedouins, "but you must keep close to the Nile. We can cross over, and when they seek us on this side, we shall be on the other. Words speeding over the copper wire will reach cities and villages on both banks of the river. The Mahdi will send us an angel who will place a finger on the eyes of the Englishmen and the Turks, Egyptians, and will screen us with wings." "Idris," said Staś, "I do not address Hamis, whose head is like an empty gourd, nor Gebr, who is a vile jackal, but you. I already know that you want to carry us to the Mahdi and deliver us to swine. But if you are doing this for money, then know that the father of this little Bint girl is richer than all the Sudanese put together." "And what of it?" interrupted Idris. "What of it? Return voluntarily, and the great Mehendi will not spare money for you, nor will my father either. But they will give us up to the government, which will order us to be hanged. No, Idris, you undoubtedly will hang, but only in case they capture you in the flight, and that surely will happen. But if you return, no punishment will be meted out to you, and besides you will be wealthy to the end of your life. You know that the white people of Europe always keep their word. Now I give you the word for both Mehendis that it will be as I say." And Staś in reality was confident that his father and Mr. Rawlinson would prefer to fulfill the promise made by him than expose both of them, and especially Nell, to the terrible journey and yet more terrible life among the savage and maddened hordes of the Mahdi. So with palpitating heart he waited for the reply of Idris, who was plunged in silence and only after a long interval said, "You said that the father of the little Bint and yours will give us a great deal of money." "Yes, but can all their money open for us the gates of paradise, which only the blessing of the Mahdi can do?" "Bismillah!" shouted both Bedouins together with Hamis and Gebr. Staś at once lost all hope, for he knew that howsoever much the people in the East are greedy and venal, nevertheless, when a true Mohammedan views any matter from the standpoint of faith, there are not any treasures in the world with which he can be tempted. Idris, encouraged by the shouts, continued, and evidently not for the purpose of replying to Staś, but with a view of gaining greater esteem and prize from his companions. "We have the good fortune not only to belong to that tribe which gave the Holy Prophet, but the noble Fatma and her children are his relatives, and the great Mahdi loves them. If we deliver you and the little Bint to him, he will exchange you for Fatma and her sons, and will bless us. Know that even the water, in which every morning, according to the precepts of the Quran, he makes his ablutions, heals the sick and eliminates sins, and think what his blessing can accomplish." "Bismillah," reiterated the Sudanese and Bedouins, but Staś, clutching to the last plank for help, said, "Then take me and let the Bedouins return with the little Bint. For me they will surrender Fatma and her sons. It is yet more certain that they will surrender her for you too." At this the boy addressed Hamis. "Your father shall answer for your conduct. My father is already in the desert, on his way to the prophet," retorted Hamis. "Then they will capture and hang him." Here, however, Idris deemed it proper to give encouragement to his companions. "Those vultures," he said, "which will pick the flesh from our bones, may not yet be hatched. We know what threatens us, but we are not children, and we know the desert of old. These men," here he pointed at the Bedouins, "were many times in Berber, and are acquainted with roads over which only gazelles roam. There nobody will find us, and nobody will seek us. We must indeed turn for water to the Bahr Yusuf and later to the Nile, but we'll do that in the night. Besides, do you think that on the river there are no secret friends of the Mahdi? And I tell you that the further south we go, the more of them we will find. Their tribes and their sheikhs are only waiting for the favorable moment to seize the sword in defense of the true faith. These alone will supply water, food and camels, and lead astray the pursuit. In truth, we know that it is far to the Mahdi, but we know also that every day brings us nearer to the sheep's hide, on which the Holy Prophet kneels to pray." "Bismillah!" shouted his companions for the third time. It was apparent that Idris' importance grew among them considerably. Staś understood that all was lost, so, desiring at least to protect Nell from the malice of the Sudanese, he said, "After 6 hours the little lady reached here barely alive. How can you think that she can endure such a journey? If she should die, I also will die, and then with what will you come to the Mahdi?" Now Idris could not find an answer. Staś, perceiving this, continued thus: "And how will the Mahdi and Smile receive you when they learn that for your folly Fatma and her children must pay with their lives?" But the Sudanese had recovered himself and replied, "I saw how you grasped Geb's throat, by Allah. You are a lion's whelp, and will not die, and she—" Here he gazed at the little head of the sleeping girl resting on the knees of old Dinah, and finished in a kind of strangely gentle voice. "For her we will weave on the camel's hump a nest, as for a bird, that she may not at all feel fatigue, and that she may sleep on the road as peacefully as she is sleeping now." Saying this, he walked towards the camels, and with the Bedouins began to make a seat for the little girl on the back of the best dromedary. At this they chattered a great deal and quarrelled among themselves, but finally, with the aid of ropes, shaggy coverlets, and short bamboo poles, they made something in the shape of a deep, immovable basket in which Nell could sit or lie down, but from which she could not fall. Above the seat, so broad that Dinah also could be accommodated in it, they stretched a linen awning. "You see," said Idris to Staś, "quail's eggs could not crack in those housings. The old woman will ride with the little lady to serve her day and night. You will sit with me, but can ride near her and watch over her." Staś was glad that he had secured even this much. Pondering over the situation, he came to the conclusion that in all probability they would be captured before they reached the first cataract, and this thought gave him hope. In the meantime, he wanted above all things to sleep, so he promised himself that he would tie himself with some kind of rope to the saddle, and as he would not have to hold Nell, he could take a nap for a few hours. The night already became paler, and the jackals ceased their whining amid the passes. The caravan was to start immediately, but the Sudanese, observing the dawn, went to a rock a few paces away, and there, conformably with the precepts of the Quran, began their morning ablutions, using, however, sand instead of water, which they desired to save. Afterwards resounded voices saying the Sobh, or morning prayer. Amidst the deep silence plainly could be heard the words, "In the name of the compassionate and merciful God, Glory to the Lord, the Sovereign of the world, compassionate and merciful on the day of judgment. Thee we worship and profess. Thee we implore for aid. Lead us over the road of those to whom thou dost not spare benefactions and grace, and not over the paths of sinners who have incurred thy wrath, and who err. Amen. And Staś, hearing these voices, raised his eyes upwards, and in that distant region, amid stony gloomy suns, began the prayer. We fly to thy patronage, O Holy Mother of God.